Hi there, I'm Kush, and this is my project. My project is on green U.S. banking, and in this project, I examine the role of commercial banks in green development, with a special attention to how the largest banks in the United States are funding climate change through investments in coal, oil, and gas. And I argue that banks should plan to divest from fossil fuels while reinvesting in renewable energy. And although banks mainly fund the climate crisis through their commercial banks, my audience for this project are actually retail bankers because retail bankers, um, retail bank users, sorry, still have power and influence over their banks. And in this informative website, I present bank users with ways they can exert influence over their banks. So I chose this format because I really wanted a website to guide and inform users like you and I on their financial institutions. So the first page I have is why banks should care. And banks are not my primary audience for this project. However, I think it's still important to have this section for why banks should care. And one of the reasons is because switching to the renewable energy transition will cost $62 trillion in total. And yearly, that's about $4.55 trillion in total. And to put that number into context, in the past 7 years, the world's 60 biggest banks have poured 5.5 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. And in comparison to the 62 trillion number, 5.5 trillion is not a lot. However, it's still a lot of money if we think about how much that contributed to oil and gas versus renewables. That money could have gone into renewable energy financing instead. So it's just adding to the problem. In addition, banks should, of course, be worried about climate change just because of ethical reasons. And we all know the IEA recommends that to neutralize emissions by 2050, fossil fuel financing has to stop now. And banks should already be trying to align themselves with the Paris Agreement to reach that 1.5 Celsius deadline or goal. And banks should be helping to reach these climate goals, more so because their consumers care. And if the banking consumers care about what banks are doing, then banks should also care because those are their stakeholders. So according to a study, about 23% of consumers identify as climate conscious consumers. And of those climate conscious consumers, they hold 35% of total deposits in banks. So banks should be looking at those climate conscious consumers and what they want, because that's a significant part of their consumer base. And climate change also threatens the long-term financial stability of banks, which banks should be worried about. There's a really great graphic here from the Fed that really outlines it. So climate risks, that's associated with increased frequencies and severities of natural disasters, rising sea level, greater temperatures, and such. And that directly translates to risks in economic activity, those changes in employment, production, and services. And these two, risk to economic activity and financial risks, are interlinked. So if the economy has risks, then there will be changes in the value of financial assets or the cost of availability or liquidity of credit for access to risk mitigation instruments. And banks will not be able to lend the way that they have been lending. So climate change increases risks for banks by impacting things like people's ability to pay back their loans, especially if their houses are being engulfed by sea level rise. Next section I have are green banks and green banking. So I wanted to make this distinction because green banks are not actually banks that we think of when we think of the word bank, like a regular bank. So green banks actually function like loans or investment funds using a wide array of financial tools, and they don't accept deposits like regular banks do. So these banks solely exist for the purpose of funding green energy development projects by creating capital um, to fund those projects specifically. So New Jersey actually announced plans for a green bank back in 2020. I wasn't able to find more information on that, but this is just a distinction I wanted to make because in my research, I talk about green banking practices and not green banks because green banks, again, they don't accept deposits. They don't function like regular banks. So consumers really have no influence over green banks per se, but they do have influence over their banks, which can participate in green banking practices. Next, I just have an overview of how banks use people's money because this is widely misunderstood. And again, here's an infographic from the Fed that really just sums it up. So when you place money in a savings account with your bank, the bank uses that money to lend to other people and businesses, and that could include companies like in the sectors of steel, cement, petrochemicals, agribusiness, beef, timber, anything like that. But I'm mainly focusing on lending to coal, oil, and gas. And then when they lend, these people and businesses, oil and gas businesses, pay the bank interest for borrowing the money. And then the bank pays you interest for using your money to make the loans and keep the difference. So that is how banking works. And something I bring up here is fractional reserve banking. And that's important because when you submit a deposit to a bank, the bank only puts a fraction of it into the reserves, or if you were to withdraw that money later. The rest of that money goes into financing, goes into lending, so the bank could continue to make profits for their shareholders. Next, follow the money. This section is really important because it shows people exactly what their money could be funding. So many banks boast net zero commitments, and it sounds really great. But when you look at the data, you realize that banks are not actually holding true to their net zero commitments, and they're continuing to fund oil and gas. So I draw from the Banking on Climate Chaos report, the 2023 version for that, and it profiles the top 60 banks in the world, 49 of which have made net zero commitments. But those 49 banks provided 81% of financing to the top 100 fossil fuel expanders in 2022. And just some statistics I thought were really important from the report was that they provided 18% of total financing in 2022. And since 2016, the top 4 United States banks, that's JP Morgan, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, have provided 1.3 trillion in fossil fuel financing, which went to liquefied natural gas, exports on the Gulf Coast, ConocoPhillips Willow project in Alaska, Line 3 and Line 5 pipelines, the oil and gas in Amazon rainforest. These are all projects that hurt communities, they hurt people, and they hurt the environment. And it's just really important to bring up that United States banks are the banks that are lending the most to fossil fuel financing. They are these four banks again, and they're pouring immense amounts of money into fossil fuel finance. If you look at the dirty dozen, which is the worst banks since the Paris Agreement in fossil fuel financing, you see that the top four are United States banks, and then it goes into some Canadian banks and Chinese banks as well. So basically, next I'm tracking divestment in coal. So many banks, like I said, they have their climate goals and they also have goals for divesting from coal. However, they haven't been staying true to those goals either. So over the years, plenty of the banks have pledged to cease lending to coal projects. However, they haven't been doing that. According to the Banking on Climate Chaos report, they have a coal policy tool, and I did a sample search, and it showed that only 20 banks participated in coal power financing in 2022, down from 29 in 2021. But they're still continuing that financing. And just a look at that coal finance policy tool. If you actually use this tool, you'll be able to see what these numbers mean. But basically, this means all of these banks do not have phase out goals for coal. And this could be because they could have made these commitments because coal is no longer profitable for banks, which gives them a reason to phase out coal, but not oil and gas, because those are still profitable sectors. Next, I go into green banking laws and regulations. So laws and regulations for the financial sector have been tried before, like the American Clean Energy Act of 2009. It passed the House, but it never moved on from there. Or the National Green Bank Act of 2019, which never passed the House. Or the Fossil Free Finance Act, which was introduced in Congress but never passed. However, the Inflation Reduction Act actually can support green banks. And remember, I'm talking about green banks as in real green banks and not regular banks that could participate in green banking practices by allocating $27 billion to make grants for the use of financial tools. There's also the UN Principles of Responsible Banking, which has many signatory banks. And through the principles, banks take action to align their core strategy with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the principles includes the Net Zero Banking Alliance, NZBA, which I will be revisiting many times. And many of the banks that fund fossil fuel finance are part of this banking alliance, which is very contradictory. There's also the Equator Principles, which is a benchmarking firm intended to serve as common baseline for banks. And these are just principles that banks should be following if they're trying to finance environmental and socially well projects. I just go over really quickly some regulatory agencies that have authority over banks right here, like the FDIC. But then I go into what people can do, like what consumers can do. And there are a few factors that influence banks, and the actions of their consumers and stakeholders is one of the largest. So I ask readers to put pressure on environmentally destructive banks by first switching their bank. This is the most powerful of the actions someone could do. They could switch to another bank or a credit union. And later I go into ways people could go about finding the right bank or credit union for them. And when they switch, they should be telling their bank exactly why. And that is because their bank is possibly funding fossil fuel finance, and they do not agree with that. So other ways people can put pressure on their banks is to send a letter to their bank or their financial advisor. There are certain petitions people could sign. They could join a shareholder resolution. If they're talking about investment, and someone is investing through their 401k provided by their employer, of course, they could talk to the HR department. Like I said, there are petitions. People can learn more. I include sources, sources for further learning in each of these pages. And this is just an overview of banks and their shareholders and all the different influences there are that could possibly influence banks to change. And the biggest ones closest to the banks are their customers, including their shareholders. But there are more customers than shareholders. Now I go into resources for choosing a bank. So when choosing bank, people still want the good parts of banking, a widespread ATM network, multiple physical locations, a good user interface, a banking app. And switching banks isn't feasible for everyone. I do recognize this. It is smart to stay at one bank if your entire family uses that bank, or if you're trying to avoid maintenance fees as a young person. And a lot of larger banks, like I said, the four largest banks in the United States that are funding fossil fuel finance, they do seem more secure to consumers because they have more regulations backing them, because they are these giant banks that are kind of too big to fail. So people do feel more comfortable banking with them. But there are other local sustainable banks. And they are smaller, so they don't have everything that larger banks do, but they can provide a more personalized experience. Sometimes they have lower fees. They'll be willing to lend to you even if you don't have the best credit. And here are just a few resources that I show visitors. So for banking, there's the coal policy tool, which we already saw, the oil and gas policy tracker. This is another policy tracker. I could just open it up real quick. Never mind, I cannot open it up real quick. Yeah, this is the oil and gas policy tracker. So this is a really great tool that people can filter by country and the type of bank they're looking for. Well, that would be just bank. The kind of commitments they want their bank to be, if they want a bank in the net zero banking alliance. And then they can look at scores that basically score projects or expansion or the phase out of oil and gas. So that's a really great tool people can use to find a bank or even evaluate their current bank. There's a website called Green America that has a really cool map. Where's the bank? The map is somewhere there, but it shows socially responsible banks near you. And I did a quick search, and in the New Brunswick area, there's a New Brunswick bank called Millennium Bank. that is the most socially responsible bank near us currently. There's a site called Mighty Deposits where you can look for data sources, and it has a guide to eco-friendly banks. It also has a really great free tool that has digest and analyze data from every US bank in the United States. It's very comprehensive. So you could look up the bank and see exactly what percentage of the bank's assets is invested in small businesses, farms, housing, and more. And it also has the most comprehensive US source of information about where all banks and credit unions invest their money. So you can look at their investments in fossil fuels. Bank Green is another tool people could use to find the best green banks in their area. There are also there's also the decarbonation targets tracker in the Banking of Climate Chaos 2023 report. So this report, this version of it at least, is very interactive. And if people scroll down, there's this financing by year and sector, and people could look at financing for fossil fuels or the top fossil fuel expanders or tar sands financing or any kind of financing they want. Let's say I want to look at coal power financing, and this will show you exactly which bank is financing that specific sector by the years. So it looks like the Bank of China is funding coal power financing the most. But if you look at total fossil fuel financing, of course, again, JP Morgan, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America are on top. Investing. I do offer some resources for this as well. So there's the fossil free funds, and people could just search funds for their 401k or retirement plan that are fossil free. Green Century and Betterment offer similar things, and the low carbon fund management team is a highly experienced group of professionals, and they have resources for finding low carbon funds. This is I already showed the tool. I do have a little bit of information on credit unions just because credit unions are a great alternative to banking. If that's a choice someone wants to make, there are downsides like credit unions. You do have to be part of a specific kind of organization or member group to join a credit union. But the great thing about credit unions is that they will not lend your money to anyone that's not a member. So it's very unlikely that they're going to lend to fossil fuel companies. So this is a sure way to make sure that you are not funding fossil fuel companies. And instead, your money would go to lending people to people in your credit union for things like their mortgages or their cars, which also just creates a better community. So some credit unions visitors could be eligible for are the Clean Energy Credit Union or even the Rutgers Federal Credit Union. I also have a page on investment banking because although I'm focusing mostly for people like you and I that don't really do investment banking, instead use retail banks, investment banking is something that individuals can participate in. Many retail banks have investment banking divisions, so people do participate in that. And basically, when you're investment banking, your bank will probably offer you funds to invest in, and you don't really know what's in those funds because they're very diversified. So there could be fossil fuel companies in that fund that they offer you. And many banks have tools that let you filter by what kind of fund you want, and they'll help you find ESG funds. But if your bank doesn't have an easy way for you to find an ESG fund, you don't have to invest with them. Because there are investment apps like Betterment where you can actually pick out the individual stocks you want to invest in, and that could just be easier for you. I also have a page on green bonds. I won't be going over it too much, but basically green bonds are the same as investment funds in the sense that you can't buy them directly or individually. They're usually in some kind of packaged within some kind of fund. So you can purchase these from your bank, but they're going to be included in some kind of exchange traded funds. Lastly, I have policy suggestions. So this is really the important stuff. So going back to the question of why banks change, the remaining major two factors are regulation, which is something that banks are required to do, and then economic conditions. And both of those factors can incentivize banks to adopt green banking policies, like divesting from fossil fuels or lending to clean energy companies. And I was hoping that the impending climate risks would be enough for banks to change, and the consumer actions and demands be enough for banks to change. But that's not always the case. So I did come up with some policy suggestions for banks. The first one is regulatory measures. So governments can introduce regulations. And we already went over some of the proposed regulations in the laws and regulations tab. Those did fail. So I do just make a note that maybe voters need to let their lawmakers know that fossil-free finance is an important issue for them, and therefore those laws and regulations could sustain in the legislative system because of that. Financial incentives. So governments and financial regulators can offer financial incentives for banks that could involve providing low interest loans, grants, or subsidies to banks that invest in renewable energy projects. In addition, implementing carbon pricing, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, strengthening fossil fuel regulations, and supporting international agreements to reduce reliance on fossil fuels will decrease the profitability of fossil fuels, which makes them an even riskier investment for banks, which will discourage banks from lending to fossil fuel companies. If they see that fossil fuel companies aren't going to be as profitable to them anymore, then they will take that financial incentive and not lend to fossil fuel companies. Meanwhile, the bank can subsidize renewable energy, invest in clean energy research, and set stringent energy efficiency standards for buildings, appliances, and transportation. So that makes a whole economy shift that prioritizes renewable energy that will make banks want to fund companies like renewable energy companies, because all of a sudden it becomes less risky to do so. Green banking guidelines. So perhaps there can be development of clear guidelines and frameworks that outline sustainable banking. That work is, of course, already being done by the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Sustainable Banking Network, Principles of Responsible Banking, the Equator Principles, and even individual banks. And this is an opportunity for banks, industry associations, and environmental organizations to just share the best practices and exchange knowledge. Because once they have guidelines, they can trade knowledge. And that establishes an industry-wide sustainability standard that can create sustainable banking networks. reporting and transparency. So encouraging banks to disclose their environmental social performance, basically. And banks have already developed long-term sustainability strategies. I went through many different banks, and they do have reports on their sustainability strategies that are integrated into their core business operations. But as we saw in the Banking on Climate Chaos report, they're not exactly following those goals that they made. So with more transparency, requiring banks to report and be transparent, the kind of information in the Banking on Climate Chaos report would be even more accessible to stakeholders. And then this would enable stakeholders to evaluate a bank's sustainability efforts and hold them accountable. And then lastly, recognition and awards. So governments, NGOs, even international entities or individual certifiers can establish awards or certifications for banks that demonstrate exemplary sustainable banking practices, and then recognizing and rewarding those banks will actually reinforce that is a desired outcome, and it'll motivate other banks to follow suit. And that creates a more competitive banking landscape. And competitive banking is a really big reason why some banks would want to change to become more competitive. I also decided to include a video and podcast bank because reading through all the resources I included isn't always a great option for people. So videos and podcasts are more digestible and easier to understand. And I've integrated all the videos into here for any visitors to my site to watch. And very lastly, I do have my citations. They're all here. Thank you for listening to my project. Hopefully this could be a useful site to people that visit it.